Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at this session where we'll be covering climate change in an aging world, asking whether there's been intergenerational theft and how we can bring generations together. With two speakers for this session, author of Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency, Jonathan Porritt, and Chris Knight, CEO of Legal & General Retail Retirement. This session is part of ILC's initial programme of activities to build a new climate change in an ageing world initiative. To put longevity on the agenda, we're living in an ageing society, but we're also living on an ageing planet on the brink. So where is the coordinated policy response to these two megatrends, which should, I think, be considered symbiotically? We're collaborating with ILC Australia and the ILC Global Alliance, and over the next year, we'll be working together ahead of a launch alongside the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, taking place in November 2021. We've got lots of work to do up until then, so those that want to join us on this initiative or want to hear more about it, we'd love to hear from you, so please do get in touch with me after this session. Last month, we ran an event with the Green Alliance, PIMFA, Newcastle University and L&G, where we explored the importance of a sustainable economy in an ageing society, how we can build a sustainable future through getting housing right, and the importance of an intergenerational approach. So this session will build on our discussion with a focus on generations, how we come together collectively to address the climate change crisis. But before we get started, I wanted to mention that we have a poll. You should all be able to see this in the top right hand of your screen. So please do look at that now and answer the question: are older people contributors, casualties, or champions of climate change? So please vote now. We'll come back to the results once we're ready with the Q&A. And please do put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll address those after the speakers. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Porritt. Jonathan is the founder director of Forum for the Future, the UK's leading sustainability charity. He's been on the front line of green campaigning for more than 45 years. He's a member of the Green Party. Throughout that time, he's worked tirelessly to promote solutions to today's converging environmental crises. I'll hand it over to you, John, now.
Thank you, Redvers. I'm delighted to join this session. I was really pleased when I heard the ILC would be organising a whole day of sessions around this big topic, around the generational shifts that are going on and some of the issues between different generations. And I guess it's fair to say that over the 45 years that Redvers referred to, I have always had in my mind this difference between what is known as intra-generational justice, which is how do we achieve justice between all people in a generation. Significant failings on that score, of course. And how do we achieve intergenerational justice? Generational justice in the different spans of time we've been on this planet and those who come after us. And that, of course, goes right back to the Brundtland Report, 1987. You'll all be very familiar with the standard definition of what sustainable development means, which is meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Couldn't be easier, in a way. And then we get a speech that we had yesterday from Antonio Guterres, the Director General of the UN, which was about as apocalyptic a speech as I've heard from anybody in a senior position. And boy, you can count on the apocalyptic rhetoric ramping up these days. But he was talking about our suicidal attack on nature and used the phrase that our planet is broken. So let's not beat around the bush at the start. We did that. Our generations did that. It didn't happen by itself. It didn't happen accidentally. We have chosen decade after decade to subscribe to a model of progress that created the wealth that society needs at that cost. It was written into the model of progress that this would be an acceptable price to pay for material progress of that kind. And that is just the bottom line here. The fact is now we have what can only be described as an extraordinary quickening of the pace of climate change. And 2020 in that regard has been an unbelievable year. I mean, really unbelievable, from the wildfires in Australia at the start of the year, all the way through to the wildfires in California and Oregon, floods and droughts, extreme weather events of one kind or another, more identified hurricanes coming in out of the Atlantic than any previous year onto America's and the Caribbean, America's eastern seaboard and the Caribbean. So just a nightmare year. There's no point describing it as anything else. And although this session isn't all about the science of climate change, because I imagine you've had plenty of opportunities to think about that, for me, the most helpful and succinct summary that I have in my mind by one of the co-authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report back in 2018 is as follows: everything is changing everywhere, far faster than anybody ever thought possible. That's the nature of the deal. And if it goes on, if that pulse of change goes on quickening in the way that it is now, you can pretty much forget 2050 targets, because they will genuinely be irrelevant. So beware of all of those politicians and businesses and other organizations committing to what they call now net zero carbon by 2050. Those 2050 dates are mostly for decoration. They don't actually make a ha'porth of difference. What really counts is what we do between now and 2030. Because if you deconstruct that science that I've just very succinctly presented to you, what it means is that we have to halve emissions of our greenhouse gases by 2030. Not by 2050, not by 2040, but by 2030. That's the scientists' advice, uncomfortable though it may be. That amounts to roughly a 7.6% reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases every year through the next decade. Now, we may have a reduction of around 7% in emissions of greenhouse gases from 2020, but we all know the reason for that. And I don't imagine anybody would want to have the equivalent of the pandemic in 2020 as the pretext for reducing emissions between now and 2030. We certainly don't want to drive this change process through one utterly calamitous nightmare for humankind after another. Now, don't turn away from that science. Don't be disempowered by it or think that somehow you can park it at the back of your mind. That is the physical reality in which we are all living today. It's what it is, frankly, as a consequence of what hasn't been over the last 40, 50 years. So against that backdrop, I invite you all now briefly just to put yourself in the minds of a 16-year-old today. Please do it consciously. Don't just say, oh yeah, okay, got it. Just for a moment, think what it would be like. 16-year-old in the UK, doesn't matter where it is, but in the UK. After this hellish year, 16-year-olds have not had a good year in 2020, that's for sure. Imagine how you think they are responding to their gathering knowledge of climate change today, and they are so much better informed than any previous generation has been before. And as you know, they are inspired by a large number of new leaders in our midst who speak to them very directly about what climate change means for them, and essentially have opened up in their minds the reality of what living in a climate emergency looks and feels like. So just to remind you of that, to give you a little burst, of course, from Greta Thunberg, my favorite go-to climate champion when it comes to this stuff. This is what she said to the Climate Action Summit back in 2019. You've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. That's us, by the way. The you there is us. For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. So how dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You are failing us, but young people are starting to understand your betrayal. Uncompromising stuff, painful to hear. I think people who were at that summit were astonished at the anger that Greta Thunberg expressed on that occasion. But why would anybody be astonished at hearing that? Because just think about it from that 16-year-old's perspective. They know for every day, for the whole of the rest of their lives, without any exception whatsoever, they will be living on a planet severely disrupted by climate change. Already, unavoidably, severely disrupted, year after year. I said 2020 was a terrible year. Don't forget that is all happening with about 1 degree centigrade of warming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we're now looking at a world in which we might have somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees centigrade warming by the end of this century. So the best case for a 16-year-old today is a life constantly disrupted by ever more extreme climate perturbation. The worst case is we don't get on top of it. We don't do what we need to do by 2030, which means we fail to do what we need to do by 2050, which means not just constant disruption, but the increasing risk of collapse. First in ecosystems, and then, of course, in human society itself. So just sticking with this story quickly for a moment, the Office of National Statistics here in the UK tells us that the anticipated longevity, you'll all know this as well as any audience I ever speak to about these things, the anticipated longevity for a 16-year-old today is roughly 88 years. That's the expectation. So you can conclude from that that a very significant percentage of 16-year-olds alive today, all else being okay, a very significant percentage of those 16-year-olds will be alive in 2100. Add to that another little statistical foray, which is that if you listen to the words of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their best case estimate for rising sea levels between now and the end of the century is 1 meter. So no less than 1 meter. That's the best possible case, given the amount of warming that we put into the atmosphere so far. And there is a worst case, I can tell you. And the worst case is more than 2 meters. But already, with a 1 meter sea level rise, the lives of hundreds of millions of people will be profoundly disrupted. And the number of climate refugees will grow and grow and grow. So just taking those two statistical inputs, as it were, what the ONS tells us, what the IPCC tells us, please, nobody be surprised any longer if you meet young people who are pretty pissed off about what is going on in this world today, because they have every right to be. And in Hope in Hell that Red was referred to, I have anticipated a growing cry of intergenerational rage from young people as they take stock of the full implications of our neglect on their lives. For me, that's going to be a critical part of the politics of climate change now. The voice of young people, the presence of young people in our lives, the reminder to all of us as adults, and particularly politicians in positions of power, the reminder of how badly they failed us so far and what the expectations are of them now to do a better job over the course of the next few decades. So that's the kind of backdrop to this, and it is a bit uncomfortable, but let me end with a sort of reminder that this doesn't necessarily mean war between the generations. It doesn't necessarily end up with rancorous recriminations of young against the old, with the old people sitting back saying, sorry, Gov, I know it was on our watch, but we didn't know it was happening. Okay, we did, but we didn't think it was going to be as bad as it is, perhaps, and even if we did, we weren't sure what we could do about it. That isn't the end of this story. For me, it's going to become equally important that we see a new pattern of intergenerational cooperation based on a new understanding of intergenerational justice. So rather than talk about that theoretically for the next 4 minutes or whatever is left to me, let me just give you a quick example. So the next time millions of young people in school today go on strike, which they will, by the way, we will see a lot of civil disobedience from a lot of young people over the course of the next decade. They could couple that with campaigning activities to put right some of the injustice that has affected older people in this country. And thinking about Chris commenting on this afterwards, just let's touch on very quickly on the story about injustice to older people in terms of the deplorable housing stock in this country. We have some of the worst quality housing stock in Europe. The issue of fuel poverty is chronic and massively damaging to the lives of millions of older people. I have in my mind a prospect that says if young people want to work for the betterment of society as a whole, one of the best things they could do would be to raise their voice in equal indignation about the utterly pathetic policies and strategy that this government has to retrofit existing housing in this country to address the issue of fuel poverty. I won't go into the degree to which it is utterly pathetic, but trust me, it is utterly pathetic at every level. It is not even remotely fit for purpose. In return, there's no reason why old people won't want to do what they can at this stage in their lives to work to support young people, to understand the natural justice that lies behind their concerns about the future. So one of the things I'm really interested in now in the future is how young and old work more effectively together to put right some of the current injustices and address some of the future injustice that is now already embedded in our particular system of wealth creation. And that could create some new dynamics, new ways of looking at political collaboration, which would be truly surprising to politicians today, who are not necessarily used to seeing older people combine forces with younger people to sort out some of the incompetence and dysfunctionality in their current systems. I'll leave it there, Redvers, because obviously we could go on for a long time, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Chris and then doing some Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic and a really good segue, I think, for Chris to come in and talk a bit about the business that he works in, how to get housing right, how to get inequalities right, that cascading of wealth, all those important things that perhaps the government is missing out on. So thank you. I'm just going to quickly introduce you, Chris, before you come in here. Chris Knight leads Legal & General's retail retirement. This is one of L&G Group's 5 divisions where the focus is on helping individuals lead longer, healthier and happier lives in retirement. So really interested to hear what you've got to say, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Redvers, and thank you, Jonathan. I should just add my plug for Jonathan's book, Hope in Hell, which I found both inspiring and energizing. And there's a few things that I took from the book, which I hope I've got right. Jonathan will no doubt correct me if I haven't. All the solutions we need to tackle the problem are at hand, and all the investment capital we need are around and about, lying around, you might say. Progressive companies must play their part. Social justice and climate change are 2 sides of the same coin. And the jobs are critical here. There's no jobless way out of this predicament, if you like, for us. And that's very much aligned with how we see the world at Legal & General. There are really a huge range of outcomes from climate change, none of which look very good. Well, none of them are good. And the quicker we start acting, the better. We know we have to invest to prevent climate change, but we now also know we need to invest to adapt to it. At the same time, the world is getting older, working age populations are falling in many parts of the world, and there's growing inequality. But this is not really the time to despair. This is the time to get on with it. And we at L&G see our role is to foster intergenerational cooperation and support, not competition or blaming. So I'm going to talk about 2 areas which we see at the sort of intersection between aging, inequality and climate change. And these 2 areas are housing and pensions. So echoing a little bit what Jonathan said, clearly we have a problem with not enough housing in this country. We have old housing stock, generally speaking, which therefore makes a high contribution to carbon emissions. In many cases, more older people proportionally live in poorer quality housing, and as Jonathan mentioned, poorer people feel the impact of energy price rises, particularly because of their low incomes and because of their poor housing. And those factors feed on each other. There's 1.7 trillion pounds of housing equity owned by the over 60s in the UK. At the moment, this is a kind of financial dead weight. It's effectively over-saving, if you like, and serves of itself very little purpose. That wealth is quite unevenly or very unevenly shared. But what is shared is kind of mental model around the sanctity of home ownership and housing wealth. A model that's kind of been developed by successive governments and pandered to by the media and probably, in fairness, companies like us in the past. And that sort of mental model is that the house must be passed on to the next generation, if you like, untouched by the owners, certainly untouched by the taxman, and very often unimproved. Irony is our friends at Key showed that only 23% of people actually believe that their kids will live in a house that they're passing down to them. So 77% of people believe that their house will be sold straight away. So we feel it's better for everybody if we can put this equity to use, releasing it to upgrade the housing stock now rather than just sitting around. We have QE, quantitative easing from the government, but releasing housing equity would be sort of a homemade QE. And what some research that we did with Demos a couple of years back showed that for every £1 of housing equity which is released to, for example, improve housing, generates £3 of gross value add for the economy, and the jobs and the alignment that Jonathan mentioned with the interests of the younger generation. So second area is pensions. And again, sort of a mindset is developed, a model, if you like, post the Second World War. In many ways, the defined benefit pension model was deeply inequitable, but it did contain a kind of social contract, which was often a force for good. And that contract was roughly along the following lines. So first of all, you got tax breaks as an individual or an employer for contributing during your working life. Secondly, you received your payout in the form of an income throughout retirement, which made it much less likely that you'd need to fall upon the state resources as you got older. And this provided the system with a very long investment horizon, because once the money was in the system, it's basically there for a very, very long time. So the third leg of this social contract was that that pension money was put to long-term investments that drove the economy and jobs and made pensions affordable from a societal perspective. At LNG, about 7 years ago, we renewed our commitment to this social contract. We've had a concerted effort to switch our money from investments in corporate debt and traded investments into real things like homes and offices, cities, hospitals, distribution centres, and so forth. So we've deployed in those 7 years £26 billion into the youth economy, making a big difference in places like Cardiff and Oxford, Leeds, Salford, Manchester, and so forth. And increasingly, we're putting this money to work on clean energy generation, modular housing, electronic vehicle charging networks, air source heat pumping, and so forth. It's pretty exciting, actually, for somebody who's worked in the industry for a very long time. We've clearly got a huge amount more to do, but we at LNG see this now as an opportunity as much as it is a risk and a responsibility. Now that contract, if you like, the old DB pension contract is broken down to a certain extent. We've had the move in the last few years to workplace pensions and other defined contribution pensions. And then with the introduction of pension freedoms in 2015, that social contract has really disappeared in the modern pension system. And we understand why low-cost, instant access model is kind of popular, but those rules kind of essentially force pension providers to invest in very much in traded liquid assets that can be sold at the heartbeat. this is a big issue, and it's a big opportunity because there is a kind of tidal wave of money coming into the DC pension system in the same decade that Jonathan's talking about. In fact, during the 2020s, UK only defined contribution pensions assets are likely to go from current 400 billions worth to basically £1 trillion over that period. So at the moment, our approach to that money is to build ESG and climate change directly into our investment processes for the 20% or so of that market that we look after. We, as a company, have made a climate pledge, which makes it clear what criteria we're going to use, or we do use, to assess companies and the consequences that we will impose upon them if they fail to make progress. We've published our ratings, and we want other people to look at them and see them. There's no secrets here, and we're determined to vote to bring about change. But that DC model does need to change as well, along with others. This is where the government can come in as well. It's not just on housing, but on pensions. We are lobbying for changes in the details of the regulations around DC and workplace pensions, so we can rebuild more of that social contract. And that each generation, I mean, we're mainly dealing with people in their 20s and 30s who are starting out on the pension savings journey. And they can feel that they can contribute to providing decent incomes in retirement by improving the productive capacity of the economy and tackling climate change. There's some very interesting research released this morning by AJ Bell that said a third of pension savers would contribute more if they knew the money was going to support the environment. I think it's a very tremendously positive feeling, and it's up to us as an industry to really capture that zeitgeist. So we agree. The solutions are there, the money is there. Now is not the time to despair, despite the frightening sounding challenges that we face, but now is the time to act. So Redford's very happy to take questions.
Chris, thank you. That was fantastic. I think it would be great to have a look at the results of the poll that we put forward at the beginning of the session, and then we can go into the Q&A. So the question was, do you think older people are contributors, casualties, or champions of climate change? Now, it is fairly high there for contributors, and casualties and champions fairly similar, champions coming out a little bit more strongly, but not by much. I think the question is important, because the question is, what do you think older people are? As in right now, what do you think they are? Not what do we see them as? What would we like them to be? So Jonathan, what's your take on that? Are you surprised with what you've seen there?
Not particularly. I'm obviously, it's good to see the recognition that older people have contributed to this problem. By definition, every single old person has contributed to this problem, but at different levels. And all the statistics show us, again, sorry if I'm getting into politically difficult territory here, that it is the super rich who are the super spreaders of carbon pollution. Let's make no bones about this. The average pensioner living in social housing in the UK today is a contributor by definition, but I can assure you it is a minimal contribution in comparison to the average plutocratic billionaire flying around the planet doing whatever those billionaires do with their excessive lifestyles, causing absolute mayhem in environmental terms. So everybody is by definition a contributor, but some are bigger contributors than others. Casualties, we're all casualties as well. That's the old thing. The really interesting thing is that percentage about champions, because for me, I'd like to see that figure obviously rising gradually through the course of the next decade, so that more and more old people are championing the cause of climate action, working, as I said, hand in hand with young people.
Thanks, Jonathan. Chris, do you have any reflections on that poll?
Yeah, look, I guess all of the above. I mean, I found Jonathan's way of describing the alignment or looking to align the interests of the generation, for housing and jobs, for example, is the attractive way of looking about it. It's probably the only way we're going to get its way out of it, because I think people, people otherwise have a sense of helplessness, and to foster a sense that people can actually contribute to solving the problems. The past is the past. We cannot literally, or at least easily, rip the carbon out of the atmosphere. But let's align around what we can do, and let's talk about the barriers that stop us, because most of them, I would argue, are mental models of things, rather than necessarily anything that's really stopping us.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to follow up on that because Jonathan, at the beginning, you talked about the sort of the rage and the sort of indignation that we should feel about what government hasn't really done over the last 30, 40, maybe 50 years. And organizations like Chris's are coming in and investing in sort of tangible solutions. And, just listening to you, Chris, there talking about encouraging effectively a next generation of climate change champions through retrofitting homes, making homes more sustainable, but then also concentrating on that cascading of wealth down into the generations. And that, to me, it seems like potentially older people are being positioned or given the opportunity to become more of a champion in this debate. But actually, are governments doing enough? And what can they do to help businesses like LNGs that are sort of ploughing the way here? It brought me to another point in Jonathan's book, which was a really shocking one, and really interesting as well, that where Margaret Thatcher, they found an archive where she had basically written a speech that said that she was going to suggest a global fuel levy, and that this was last minute taken out by Nigel Lawson. What are we in a different place now? Maybe that's a question for Jonathan after you've responded, Chris, but I'm keen to see what you think about, what governments can do more.
That's a tragic story, isn't it? Whatever your politics, Nigel Lawson's an interesting guy. His role in the Brexit debate, you could also have a good debate about too, to be honest. I think it's on the narrow issue of retrofitting homes. There's been a checkered history, let's say, to be kind, with programs that have been launched and incentives, launched and pulled and so forth. And I know there's been some questions around the most recent one, but it is an obvious alignment. I think having a meaningful incentive there and a program that is going to last that is super important. I think there are elements in the mortgage system, including the lifetime mortgage system, or what's often known as equity release system, which make it very difficult and expensive to release relatively small amounts of money. So I say relatively small amounts of money because let's say retrofitting a house, a standard house would be £16,000 to £30,000. That may not, for people on this call, feel like a lot of money, but if you're on a state pension, £30,000 is 4 years of pension income. It's a lot of money, but relative to the equity that people might on average have in their house, it's a relatively small amount. So helping us to make it safe, because this is important stuff. You need to treat people carefully and safely, but safe from a financial perspective, but easier to generate the cash, if you like, to pay for retrofitting is something that the government could really help us with.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chris.
It's interesting to reflect on the latest outing of Boris Johnson in terms of explaining the government strategy for climate, his 10-point plan, which you probably couldn't avoid hearing a tiny bit about last week. And it's a tale of two policies. So first policy is banning the sale of any petrol or diesel vehicle after 2030. That is a serious policy. I can tell you that is going to put everybody to the test inside the automotive industry and those responsible for charging infrastructure. I mean, it's going to be a massive change. Okay, so hats off. It actually is a policy that has already impacted and will make a huge difference. Compare that with the policy on retrofit, which was pretty non-existent and referred to more in the spending review in terms of a nominal sum of £650 million being put forward to help with the retrofit program. In the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019, they promised 9.2 billion to do a proper a start of a retrofit program. Because as Chris said, you have to commit over decades to get this right. It's going to take us decades to retrofit our existing housing stock. So 9.2 billion is a start. But this incoherence is chronic. I'll just share with you one last statistic. The government axed the whole zero carbon homes agenda in 2050. Just got rid of it completely. Up until that point, we were gradually building more and more energy efficient homes, lower and lower emissions of greenhouse gases, etc. And here's the tragedy. By next year, had they stuck with the zero homes agenda, every new home in this country would have been built to a near zero carbon standard. Every new home. Whereas now, very few homes are built to a zero carbon standard. So we've wasted an entire decade, during the course of which 2 million, roughly 2 million, probably 1.8 to 2 million new homes will be built. Each and every one will have to be retrofitted. Each and every one. So this is, what do you call that? Lunacy? Criminality? You pick your word for it.
Yeah. Can I just add, Revers, as well? Okay. I think it's not really my topic, but social housing and the stock of social housing is a very serious issue, and we have to be realistic as a country also about the funding of that, because there's many housing associations, social housing providers that will not be in a position to materially to invest to upgrade their existing housing stock, and they're going to need some serious help to do that.
Absolutely, and we're setting ourselves up for failure, aren't we? If that housing stock isn't fit for purpose. I've got a question actually that's come in from Sophia Cleanhouse, which is a question which sort of relates to our topic of general topic of longevity, and that as people live longer, we're going to see potentially a growing middle demographic. And actually, a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is concentrated on this growing middle demographic. But now you have people in their 30s and 60s, arguably that might want to be included in this intergenerational strategy. And Sophia is saying, look, in my late 20s, when I was at school, we had a lot of campaigning on this area, but only just seeing the political interest now. And with a shift in even younger people engaging, as you referenced, Jonathan, how can civil society improve engagement with that middle group?
Good point. And I don't want to rule out, obviously, anyone between the age of 16 and 70 or 16 and 60, whatever it is. I clearly, as many people as possible in those intervening age groups who gets involved in this, the better. I mean, it's really important. All I'm saying is we know from experience that there are definitely barriers to some people taking on that campaigning challenge as readily as they might in other age groups. And that's often to do with the need to build careers, to pay off mortgages, to look after kids, to prioritize all the stuff that goes on in that part of your life as you work your way through those different decades. So it's not that I discount the importance of engagement by those generations, just I'm sort of very conscious that we have an opportunity now to do things slightly differently. And I'm also mindful pragmatically that politicians listen to different age groups differently. Don't forget, the triple lock today for pensioners in the UK is a pretty astonishing policy commitment. It didn't happen again accidentally. It happened because there was some mighty effective lobbying and campaigning from older people to ensure that their share of the national wealth was properly distributed at that level. And don't get me wrong, I wholly welcome that. And you probably notice that politicians listen differently to young people, because every now and then their consciences are pricked and they suddenly think, oh my God, yeah, no, that's, if not my child directly, then it's my children's generation that I'm talking about here. Right. So there's different sort of hearing mechanisms going on for politicians with young and old. And I want to squeeze that. That's what I want to do. I want to put politicians in a position where they can't help but hear those voices much more acutely and act on them.
And it has a humanizing effect.
Indeed, it really does.
I've got a question for both of you, really. We've only got a minute or two before we have to close for questions. We could really go on. It's been a great chat. And this is about language really, and framing, and how we, and it's to do with the nature of the session as well, on bringing people together. And how do you bring people together, under what banner, with what language, and under what sort of, you know, behavioral drive? Is the idea of waging war, for example, on climate change a good way to frame it? Is that a good idea, or is it really damaging? You know, we've heard our Prime Minister talking about waging war on COVID. Obviously, casualties of climate change will be and are more often than not vulnerable and older people, and vulnerable and older people are casualties of COVID. But is this a dangerous narrative? Keen to hear what you think about that. And or is it something that we can all get together behind and use that collective rage, Jonathan, that you spoke about at the beginning?
I'm nervous about going to war analogies. I've spent a large part of my life campaigning against nuclear weapons, campaigning against the arms trade, campaigning for peace. And when you suddenly hear militaristic metaphors being used to explain what we need to do to address climate change, including occasionally people saying we must go to war against carbon. And I'm thinking, you haven't really worked this out yet, have you? It's not carbon that we need to go to war against. It's against the ways in which we cause carbon to be released disproportionately into the atmosphere. So I'm nervous about it. But I will tell you a funny last anecdote at Red was when I was listening to Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden, talk about his $2 trillion recovery package, all based on the low carbon economy. $2 trillion, massively bigger than any other country has put forward so far. It suddenly sounded to me a bit like the Pearl Harbor moment for America in the 21st century. It had all that same sense of urgency. We need to do now in addressing climate change what we did in the middle of the 20th century to address the threat of war.
Excellent, thank you, Jonathan. We've only got a couple of minutes. Chris, do you have a view on that at all?
Yeah, I'm emphatically the view that war is completely the wrong way of talking about and thinking about it. I think we know what the kind of end point is, which is zero. What we have to achieve, like, is zero carbon. And I think we should put it more in terms of a race to get there. The faster the better. And I think the other language I think we could hopefully change, and we have certainly inside Legal in General, is opportunity, because I think if it's a kind of competition in the form of a race, so to speak, and an opportunity, then certainly more appeals to me anyway, and that's how we're looking at it, finding ways to deploy all the, so the solutions are there, the money is there, we just got to make it happen, and there's really nothing stopping us other than our own mental models of the world.
Excellent, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jonathan. That was a really, really good session, and thank you to all of the contributors and the delegates as well that put the questions in and the poll. That was great. So this conference is really focused on bringing the ideas of bringing generations together, exploring challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, and framing the conversation around today's and tomorrow's older people. And I thought this session, really did that. We touched on some really important topics, I think, in terms of tackling inequalities, unlocking wealth, how we rethink and do retirement income, Chris, how we can future-proof the way we live as well, but also touched on the idea that climate change, being considered as not just necessarily an environmental problem, Jonathan, but as a social problem, a social justice matter. And I like the idea of unifying rage, that shared experience, not waging war perhaps, and the idea that a multifaceted challenge can only be tackled together, I think, and I hope that we can persuade people it's important and possible to mobilise everybody, regardless of age, to tackle this enormous challenge that we have. So I'm afraid we have to close now. Thank you everyone for your involvement. Thank you to the speakers and everyone who joined. Please do join promptly now for the next session and the breakouts for the afternoon session, which will follow immediately after this. Thank you.